Good morning, everyone. Before I start, I need to pass a message to you from Young. Please switch off your iPhones so that no one is disturbed. So let's start our first session today. Good morning, everyone. I feel very honored to chair and boundaries. Let me give you an introduction of him first. Professor John Holland studied physics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and received a bachelor degree in 1950. Then studied mathematics at University of Michigan, receiving a master's degree in 1954. In 1959, he received first computer PhD from the University of Michigan. He's now a professor of psychology and professor of electrical engineering and computer science at the University of Michigan. Professor Holland is a member of the Board of Trustees and the Science Board of Santa Fe Institute. He received MacArthur Fellowship in 1992 and is a fellow of World Economic Forum. In 1975, he wrote a groundbreaking book on genetic algorithms, adaptation in natural and artificial systems. In 1995, he published Hidden Order: How Adaptation Builds Complexity, and this book was translated into Chinese and has become a popular scientific book in China. In 1998, he wrote a book, Emergence from Chaos to Order. And last year, 2012, he published his new book, Signals and Boundaries. My computer is distracting. Building blocks for complexity as adaptive systems. While preparing for chairing this session yesterday, I did a Google Scholar search of the citation of his groundbreaking book. It showed 17 versions or reprints. By checking the 1992 version, the citation shows 34,377 times. All these may have been known to most of the audience today. People in the audience, especially our NTU student, may wonder how a professor could become such a great scientist. Whenever people ask John the same question, he always says that it's because he's very fortunate to have good mentors and professors who gave him opportunities to do what he liked when he was young. Because nowadays, we all know professors have a lot of teaching, a lot of responsibilities. So he feels great, fortunate to have professors and mentors who supported him when he was young. The flexible system at MIT at that time allowed him, who was a student of physics, to do his dissertation with an astronomer, which was never heard of, who was working in the electrical engineering department. And just because John attended his lectures and he liked his teaching, and he decided to just go to visit him. And he knocked at his door and told him about his interest. And then he became interested in working on his dissertation for the first real-time computer, which was called Whirlwind, being built then at MIT. Because of that experience, and IBM recruited him for the planning group for the first commercial computer, the first electronic programmable commercial computer. We can see that his curiosities and gained experience set interdisciplinary part of John's research at a very young age. What is also indeed true is that John has a mind that is interested in almost every subject that is complex in nature. His solid theoretical work seems to be all based on natural sciences such as logic, mathematics, physics, biology, ecology, etc. But what made him able to see the relations of the complex parts in a system in the real world was due to his profound knowledge and broad interests of all kinds. For example, his interest in linguistics and communication studies started in the early years of his career. He has never given it up. Over the years, he has organized several language workshops together with Professor Professor William Wang at Santa Fe and in various places in Asia that have influenced him and a number of us in our research directions in linguistics. To me, research in language acquisition is like looking for a lost key to the mystery of a human ability and a disability or handicapped ability, in the sense that we are never able to learn a foreign language as well as a native speaker when we reach a certain age. To find such a lost key, we need to see the fact that language by itself is a complex adaptive system of its own. And our exploration needs to take a multidisciplinary approach to look at old issues from a new perspective. As a person, John is talented in many things. He loves music and literature. He took flying lessons when he was just a high school student, and he tried Chinese calligraphy, practiced Chinese painting, plays Go and other board games. He also plays poker with a group of professors at Ann Arbor and at professional level. He gains and loses, as he says, and out of all his interests, he has got many interesting ideas for solving his research questions. Even his sense of humor, and together with his sketching and painting skills, allowed him to be the cartoonist for the MIT Humor magazine, which when he was an undergraduate student at MIT. And now then, we are not surprised to know that the drawings of the pictures and the diagrams in his books all were done by himself. Another interesting thing, or another thing that the students in the audience may like to know is that John is also a great professor and a good listener. He would never say, "Is there anything else?" to mean, "You have asked too many questions, you should go," which was told by a visiting professor in his recent talk that some professors do so when they get bored with students' questions. With Professor Holland, you can ask whatever and however many questions you have. You can even trust him to give you credit for your crude thoughts, no matter how absurd you think you are. He can always see some reasonable connections and understand why you think so and what can be generated from your ideas. Over the years working with John, I have spoken out and discussed with him some of my absurd ideas, such as sound symbolism, consciousness in newborns for language development, etc. But each time, John took it seriously and raised further questions. As a conclusion, may I say that John's mind is actually a great model of a complex adaptive system because it is constantly upgraded, constantly adapting to the changes of the world, constantly generating new ideas. Now, here's a good example. Soon after his new book, Signals and Boundaries, was published last year, he started writing another new book, which he has completed the first draft and will soon be published by Oxford University Press. So before he's too quick for us to follow him and move on to writing his another book, let's welcome John to talk about his current book, Signals and Boundaries. Let's welcome John.
Am I on? Yeah. Thank you, Helena, for an impossible introduction. And thank you for pointing out one of the advantages of old age, that you were young at the right time. And I'm tempted to say, is there anything else? No. All right. That didn't work. Oh. Uh-huh. Oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you. What I'd like to do is relate this idea of signals and boundaries to some of the questions that we've been talking about, and especially some of the things that Murray raised yesterday and some of the other questions. So let me see if I can make this do the right kind of thing. Yeah. And I wanted to start off with a couple of questions that have been posed when I've been here at previous times. Many of you will recognize the iconic casino downtown. And I wanted to look at two things that have been done recently that, in my opinion, do involve this notion of boundaries. The one is that behind the casino, they took a saltwater marsh, and by preparing it, the soil around it in the right way, it now supplies fresh water to Singapore. And the other thing is, many of you have experienced the automatic traffic system, which, while not exactly solving the traffic problem, makes things much better in Singapore than most large cities. So one of the points I'll try to make is, once you can put the appropriate boundaries in place, and notice that each of these has a filtering operation, once you can put the appropriate boundaries in place, then many of the results you desire are automatic from that point onward. When I was, again, one of these things of youth, when I was in high school, biology text sketched a biological cell as a thing full of a jelly called cytoplasm with no structure at all. And now, and this is a very crude sketch, but shows you just how much structure there is in the cell, and it's very crowded with boundaries of all kinds. And one of the points I will make is that boundaries give rise to specialists. And this is an important thing in many different ways. Now, some subset of you have seen this diagram way too many times. But here is a diagram of a complex adaptive system where you have multiple agents interacting and adapting or learning. And because the way the agents interact is nonlinear, that is, they work typically by conditional if-then rules. So the aggregate behavior is not, as Murray and others have pointed out, is not the simple sum of the aggregate of the behavior of the individuals involved. Another thing that's important in these systems is that the influence is both top-down and bottom-up. It's not one or the other. So if I look at something like the stock market, the Dow Jones average in the United States influences the individual agents. If the market average is rising, some agents will buy, some will sell. So there's this top-down influence, and yet the market average is an average of their net summed behavior. So these two things interact in important ways, and all of these interactions are mediated by boundaries. And I'm going to use the same term semi-permeable boundary to emphasize the filtering aspect of these boundaries, that they let some things through, but not everything. And just to give you some examples, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but this just gives you a kind of list of some of the complex adaptive systems and how they're involved in important issues of the day. Everything from the internet down to the immune system. Each of these problems, you have many interacting agents, and they all change over time. They do learn or adapt. And these semi-permeable boundaries constrain the interactions. And the question, of course, is how and why, and is this a good procedure? Just so that I can give you some examples of the things we don't know, all the complex adaptive systems we've looked at involve something I'll call lever points. And the most obvious one is a vaccine. The immune system is extremely complex, but a vaccine is simple. It gives a long-lasting, directed action, desirable action. Unfortunately, we have no theory that tells us where to look for these lever points. So we get them by God and by guess. Open-ended evolution. All of these systems have a long history, and they show a long period of change, but ecosystems are a good example. We have no computer models, at least that I know of, that exhibit open-ended evolution. That's rather surprising, because there are a lot of people that have tried. And finally, all of these systems have a hierarchical organization of boundaries within boundaries within boundaries. Biological cells, like the one I just drew, are an example. And again, there's no theory or general model that tells us what are the mechanisms that cause these boundaries to form. How do they form? And just to point out again some examples of the relations between boundaries and what I'll call mechanisms, which are what typically generate the boundaries, and the effects. I've just put up a few things, and again, most of these are familiar. Let me talk about the last one, which deals with language, where we have communities, we have utterances as the mechanisms of communication, and they coordinate the activity of the community. Now, just to give an example of this that always amuses me, chimpanzees have a set of utterances that they use in various circumstances. And one circumstance is when there is another tribe of chimpanzees invading their territory. And they have a warning call. Now, chimpanzees are a male-driven society or tribe. The males do everything. They get the choice of all the food. The alpha male drives the group in various ways. So when these foreign group of chimpanzees come into the area, the alpha male and all the other males take up shouting this warning cry that there are invaders. Occasionally, and I love this, occasionally one of the females in the group will pick up the idea of shouting that there is this group coming in when there is no group. The males rush off to tackle the group. The female rushes in, grabs all the food, and goes the opposite way. That's just a lovely example. They say that You can't lie unless you have language, but in that case, I think we have to let the fact that the chimpanzees have language, or at least as female. Okay, so this notion of a boundary that lets some things through and some not, I will discuss in terms of the notion that there is a condition in the boundary that says which kinds of identifiers do I require on some chemical or reactant or signal in order to let it through the boundary. So in this case, if I can make this work, yeah, we have the thing that's coming in, and in biology that would be typically called the ligand, and we have the receptor in the membrane, and this thing is looking for a particular site, and it says, I don't care what else is there. So it's just picking out a particular site on the signal. This could be effectively an address. And it says, if it has the right address, it can go through. These things I'm going to call tags to have a general name for them. And here are some examples in standard areas where we can talk about, say, in the case of the cell, the protein signals, and in the case of food webs, and so on. In each of these cases, it's rather surprising that we have this notion of tags, that there is a small, we could call it active site, that determines what happens. Not the whole thing, just a small part. And one thing that was pointed up and emphasized yesterday that I take as very important is that in order to understand these organizations, much as in evolutionary biology or any place else, we have to know something of how it came about, how this organization rose. And you'll notice that a lot of the things that we call now big data are really just snapshots. They're the way the system looks right now. And that diagram that we had at the very start, which showed this complex network, is a snapshot. It doesn't tell us much about how the thing changes. It tells us how it looks right now. And to understand that diagram, I'm going to make the claim that you've got to know more than that. You've got to know how that diagram came to be, how it evolved. In complex adaptive systems, we have this notion that we should look for mechanisms that cause the signals and the boundaries to co-evolve. They work back and forth with each other. Now, there's a nice idea, Christian Mortensen, in language, that not only do we adapt to language, but language adapts to us. And his experiment is a very pretty thing. He simply takes various sounds and lets them go around a group. Many of you have played this whispering game where you sit around a table and you whisper something to the person next to you, and that person whispers on till it goes around the table, and almost always it comes out to be something quite different from what started out. He does this with phonemes, with individual utterance sounds, and some of them survive much better in this circle than others. So in this sense, his idea is that the sounds that we tend to use have adapted to our nervous system. So it goes both ways. I find this a very pretty idea and very suggestive for other areas in complex adaptive systems. Another thing that we talked about yesterday and that to me is important is that we're not trying to optimize. We're trying to improve in many cases. We're trying to steer the system. We're not trying to somehow decide, oh, this is the best. And it's easily shown that even for very fundamental parts of a biological cell, one fundamental part is the Krebs cycle, which is in every aerobic organism. The Krebs cycle, you would think, would be highly refined. Now, it is pretty efficient, but in fact, a modern biochemist can go in there and design a version of that cycle that's more efficient. Okay. So it's adequate to the cause, more than adequate, but not optimized. And this is important to keep in mind, I think, when we talk about complex adaptive systems. Another thing is that most of us, in particular in my own training, we like the idea of matrices and fixed points and eigenvalues and eigenvectors and so on, and basins of attraction and so on. But in these systems, it's relatively easy to show that the basins of attraction change over time as the system evolves. And so even there, we have to be very careful. Now, yesterday it was mentioned, and I like this idea, that metaphor can play an important role in science, and especially in these complex systems where it's difficult to make connections sometimes. And the thing that I like about this is that if you read the collected papers of James Clerk Maxwell, you will find that he's one of the very few scientists who've written very carefully about how his ideas came about. And metaphor was a major technique that he used, and I've just given one example, that he went from the notion of tow lines, familiar in the canals in Britain at the time, to the notion of lines of force. And he goes on in this way, talking about vortices and so on, in a way that's very nice. And if you want to find out about how one of the world's major scientists thought and came up with these incredibly elegant set of equations, this is a good place to read. Now, we mentioned tags, these particular sites, and I will claim that tags provide a way of steering signals through these membranes in the system. And so if I can change the tags, I can change the network of interactions. And so we're going to talk a bit about that. If I put a new tag in a system like a biological cell, then in effect I've suggested a new routing through the membranes in the cell. Now, that may or may not be any good, but the nice thing about these complex adaptive systems is they involve many agents, so they're highly parallel. So I can divert a small part of the system, much as, say, an ant in an ant nest. One ant can go wandering off and may find a new source or may not. But the hive or the group or the nest as a whole continues to work pretty efficiently. We can find things like this in complex adaptive systems. So suggestion is I can afford to try new tags because the system is highly parallel. And here's the way I'm going to go about this. And now we're going back to classical Greece. In Athens, you had an urn, and voting was to put a black ball or a white ball into the urn. And a typical issue was whether some particular person was going to be exiled from the city. And it is, in fact, that notion of putting a large number of black balls in the urn that gives rise to our current, still alive expression of being blackballed. Okay, so this notion was the early notion in probability theory. What's the probability that if I reach in this urn at random that I'm going to get a black ball? And so in the late Middle Ages, I can't remember which century, but people started using this notion of balls in urns as a way of getting at the notion of probability. Proportion of the balls of each color in the urn was the probability, or the concentration. And these are interchangeable. So we're going to use this idea, but we're going to modify the urns so they have gates. The urn will only let certain colors of balls go in. So if I'm back in classical Greece and I don't want to be exiled, I forbid anybody to put black balls in the urn. Now, if I think of semi-permeable membranes, this means that certain proteins can go through the membrane and some cannot. And we're just going to imitate this with the urns, where in fact then the concentration of each color of ball is the concentration of each different kind of reactant, say in the biological cell. It's a simple idea. And then in order to get the effect of multiple agents, we're going to put these urns in a geometry, and we will allow diffusion to take place by simply reaching in one urn, picking out a ball, and putting it in some nearby urn. Now notice, if I have these gates, however, I can reach in to one urn and say pick a black ball, and then find that it won't be allowed in the adjacent urn, in which case it just stays where it started. Okay. Now I'm going to make the point as we go along that with this very simple model, it's possible to do some real mathematics. And more to the point, and I won't spend time on this, but you can use the theory of Markov processes to a good advantage here. My agent says that every time I add an equation in a book, I cut the audience by half. I'm now giving permission to at least half of you to fall asleep. What I'm going to look at is a very simple example that actually do the calculations in front of you. This is easy arithmetic. I'm going to look at two urns where there are two irreversible reactions. And in the first urn, I have A plus B yields a new thing, Y. And then Y can go through the gate, whoops, wrong one, can go through the gate and come into the gate of an adjacent urn where Y plus Y produce C. Okay, so that's all there is to it. We use now something that I'm sure all of you have seen many times, elementary chemistry, where the proportion of A and B in the first urn is 1/2. The production of Y in the first urn is 1/2 times 1/2, but I can either take A first or B first, so BA and AB, and that's the reason the factor 2 is in there. And this is a mistake that still, after 84 years, I tend to make from time to time and forget to put that 2 in there. Anyhow, so production of Y in urn 1 is simply 1/2 per time step. That's the probability. Then, because urn 2 contains only Y, the production rate there is 1. It's 1 times 1. If I pick a ball, it's going to be Y. And so the net production is 1/2 times 1. That of the two urns is just 1/2. Now notice what we have is a very simple model of a production line. The first urn does the first step of the production. The second urn does the second step of production. So there's just a simple two-stage production line. And I want to recall for you something that most of you have encountered one way or another. One of Adam Smith's major examples was talking about, at his time, they had just, in effect, produced the first production line. It used to be that blacksmiths would produce a straight pin, just for pinning things. And that straight pin was a highly expensive item. Only if you were in the upper middle class could you afford to buy a straight pin. At the time that Smith was writing, specialists took over. One blacksmith would draw the wire, another would clip it, another would sharpen it, another would add the head of the pin. This increased the production rate of straight pins by a factor of 10, and it made them a common item available to most people. So this business of going from the general craftsman to a production line of specialists made a huge difference. I'm going to try to illustrate that point now. So now we're going to take a single urn. This is the craftsman blacksmith that does everything. So all of the reactions, both the A plus B yields Y and the Y plus Y yields C, take place in a single urn. Now at this point, you notice that, whoops, I always hit the wrong one, that they're in equal amounts in that urn. So 1/3 and 1/3 and 1/3. They're just in equal proportions. And so we do the same calculation. It comes 1/3 times 1/3 times 2 is 2/9, and then we do the calculation for Y. Now notice, Y is only 1/3 of the population, so the rate is much slowed. is 1/3 times 1/3, and that yields 1 knight. To be fair, we use 2 urns, 2 blacksmiths in the specialist line, so we're going to compare this to 2 that are working side by side. What's the difference between the 2 specialists and 2 working side by side? And we see, lo and behold, a factor of 10. With this very simple model, we get this huge speed up by putting some specialists in there. Now, my claim is that I can do some much more sophisticated things with multiple urns and hierarchies of urns where I can still do reasonable calculations and still find out something about what's going on in these complex adaptive systems. And one of the things that we would like to look at is how do these things co-evolve over time to produce specialists? How is it that we can change the tags in urns where we had independent urns and suddenly the urns become coupled? Because if they become coupled, then by just ordinary biology, Darwinian fitness, this increased efficiency is going to favor them in any set of interactions that they're involved. And at least some of you know that at this point I begin shouting about recombination in contrast to mutation. Even in current biology textbooks for even undergraduates, it is usually said that mutation drives evolution. I'm just going to say not so. Mutation takes place about 1 in every million to 10 million times in a given place in the chromosome. Everything in the DNA is there to prevent mutation, to make it a stable chemical. Okay. What about recombination? How frequent is sometimes called crossover? Why is it that you look partly like one parent and partly like the other? Every one of us is a combination of some genes from one parent and some genes from the other. This is recombination. If you look at 2 successive generations, nobody in the second generation is identical to anybody in the previous generation. This is all because of crossover or recombination. And of course, humans have known about this for a long time. Have used it. When we breed horses or cattle or something like that, you try to combine those elements, those animals that have good characteristics to get animals with combinations of those characteristics. And this has been known for a very long time. My claim is that primarily evolution is driven by this crossover and recombination that occurs in every individual in every generation rather than mutation, which is extremely rare. Now, there's a good question here, which I'm not going to answer for you right off, but if I have this recombination and no individual in the next generation is like any individual in the previous generation, we only get one Einstein, we only get one Murray Gell-Mann, what information is being preserved from one generation to the next? Since we're not preserving details, what's being preserved? I'm going to talk now in terms of recombination of building blocks. These pieces, and you can think of them as tags or parts of tags that are being recombined to yield new tags. And one thing we know from genomics is what they call their motifs are building blocks that occur in many different functional combinations. All right, and this is a slide that's awfully familiar to some of you. This is simply to make this point about the role of building blocks. What I'm going to do is take the human face, and I'm going to divide it into 10 different features: hairstyle, shape of the forehead, eyebrow shape, eye shape, and so on. 10 different features layered. And then I'm going to give 10 alternatives for each feature. So in here, whoops, slow learner, we have 10 different eye shapes, okay? 10 different eyebrow shapes, and so on. This face was created by picking one building block for each feature. This style of hair, this style of eyebrow, and so on. Okay? Now, the question that I love to ask my classes, really two questions. How many building blocks are there? And how many faces can I make from them? First off, how many building blocks? I hear some people saying 100. There's 10 sacks with 10 blocks. That comes out to be 100 building blocks. How many faces? I can pick 1 of 10 from the first sack, 1 of 10 from the second. 10 times 10 times 10, 10 to the 10th power. 10 billion faces, all different, all legitimate faces from 100 building blocks. Claim that's what politicians use to recognize all the people they know. And by the way, this is something you can test as to whether you have the right building blocks unless you've actually dealt with chimpanzees in a zoo. They're going to look pretty much alike to you. You're going to have a hard time distinguishing their faces because they have different building blocks, by and large, for their faces from those that we have. And you just haven't had any practice in those building blocks. So building blocks are important, and when we come to talk about building blocks for tags and this business of getting through these urns with different kinds, I would claim that recombination of the right kinds of building blocks are what lets signals and the membranes or boundaries co-evolve. Recombining those building blocks let me make new gates for the urns and new signals to go through those gates. So, another point that fits with this is that when we look at these semi-permeable boundaries, they tend, as we saw in that simple example, to increase the concentration of selected signals or selected reactants. By increasing the concentration, you increase the rate at which they interact or communicate with each other. So the net effect is all these semi-permeable boundaries in the cell act much like catalysts. They speed up reactions of the selected reactants. And that's an important effect. So quickly then, what we've been saying is that when we look at these reactions, they are controlled by tags. And when we look at that, then we can have conditions, these gates on the urns, these semi-permeable membranes with their gates that let us sort the various kinds of reactants. And then, by increasing the concentration of particular reactants, you increase the rate of combination or reaction within that membrane. So this is the points that I've been sort of making. Actually, if there's some questions at this point, I'm quite willing to take an interruption. Okay? Most of you fell asleep when I gave you permission. Now, I'm not going to go through these, but these are some of the more mathematical things that we can do to study these things. We can, for particular purposes, use difference equations. We can use the notion, the urn model that we talked about. We can use this kind of billiard ball mechanics, Markov processes, and finally we can look at rule-based signal processing. These are all more formal techniques. I'm not going to go through them. It's just to point out that there are ways to handle this other than trying to just do simple models. And if I went in the right direction, I would like to do this in terms of something that's very hard to implement. And I find that an institution I dearly love, for instance, is losing the capacity to do this. And this is what I call exploratory modeling, where I have some notion of mechanisms or pieces that I want to explore. I want to see how these mechanisms work together. I'm not trying to imitate data or forecasts or do anything. I just want to explore the possibility of these mechanisms. What can they do? You'll find that in most places, it is very hard to fund exploratory research. In the United States in particular, the National Science Foundation and most of the other funding agencies like the National Institutes of Health want to see what they call deliverables. And that usually means a 3-year horizon. And 3-year horizon is way too short for big problems. Yeah?
Your parenthetic remark there on the emergence of language is what leads to my question.
Oh.
What happens when in the signaling you have conscious agents, i.e. in human societies, and you can anticipate what the consequence will be and can differentiate different possibilities and make choices across those boundaries?
Yeah. This is very important. And what we find is, for instance, that in these systems, we build what I could call internal models. And so we can do look ahead, we can do anticipation. But notice that this doesn't simply require consciousness. E. coli anticipates food by swimming up a food gradient. So anticipation is essential. It plays a big role in this. And I will just refer to Helena to answer all such questions. But this is, for instance, part of the the transition from warning calls to the ability to communicate in a forward-looking sense. And so when a tribal leader can say, look over there, beyond the hill, beyond the light of sight, this is an important advance. And the kind of stuff that Helena and also working with Helena, we're trying to do is see what these levels are as you progress from warning calls all the way up to the kind of thing that we expect of a child, even at a year and a half. Other questions? Yeah.
I don't think that, a little earlier in the lecture, you talked about improving or steering systems to make them better. And I guess my question is, what criteria do you use? Are they normative judgments? And how do you know?
Whether it's an improvement.
Yes.
Yeah. Now I can refer to Peter Ho. The risk assessment, if I think of steering, I mostly think of, I have some knobs that I can twist. This could be, like the control panel on an airplane. And this has a lot to do. I don't know, in general, when I start out, what an optimal flight path is going to be from the US to Singapore. But what I do along the way is some steering in terms of knobs that I can twist. And I might not be doing something optimally, but I can usually measure something, and this is the thing we see on the panel in front of us. What's the headwind, how much fuel am I using, and so on. In general, then, steering is a bit easier because I look and use local criteria rather than global criteria. So that's part of the answer. But this is a complicated problem. But I do advocate steering. Yes, yeah. In fact, the people that commissioned me to write this book for Oxford, that was their first question. Can you distinguish complicated from complex? Here are a couple of hypotheses that I would like to find out more about. And one of these is local concentrations induced by feedback and recycling provide opportunities for the formation and adaptive radiation of agents. In other words, these things that the urns allow, for instance, recycling, give the agents opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. Now, I mentioned an example that is very urn-like. In a tropical rainforest, we have plants that are cup-like called bromeliads. Now, interesting, in a rainforest, they grow on the poorest soil in the world because the heavy rain leaches all the nutrients out of the soil into the nearest creek. So the soil is very poor. And if you look at a tropical rainforest, it seems like everything is directed to keeping these nutrients from reaching the ground. All kinds of basins. Okay. The bromeliad is a good example. It catches the water. Frogs, various kinds of insects, and so on, breed in that pool of water. The waste products feed the bromeliad. This whole recycling plays a big role. And so what we would like to know in more general ways, and you know, we talk about recycling all the time. If we have a production process, we'd like to recycle this, and you can actually do in these urn models some calculations that show that it does make a difference, and so on. That is something that we need to know a lot more about. Okay. Agent formation. We find that in these systems, we get more and more, when we look at them, observe the real systems, we see more and more kinds of agents. And some of these specializations and adaptations are really just totally remarkable. Darwin had studied, he wrote a very nice book. If you are interested in orchids, one of the best books on orchids that you could read. And in that book on orchids, he discussed an orchid called the comet orchid. The comet orchid had a nectar tube about this long. He knew from his studies that moths pollinated and fed at that kind of orchid. But that would mean that this moth would have to have a tongue this long. Darwin, and people say he never made any predictions, but Darwin actually said there must be such a moth. About 10 years ago, for the first time, they filmed that moth in Madagascar. So it's just, you know, it's a lovely thing. That kind of specialization, if either that orchid or that moth disappeared, the both of them would die out. What allows them to sustain themselves in this highly specialized condition? The other thing that we notice is in these systems, unless we have a big meteor come down to destroy all the dinosaurs, that these systems tend to increase in complexity over time. More specialists, and specialists make possible still more specialists, and so on. These three things I would like to know a lot more about. Claim that these gated urn models give us at least one method to explore some of these things. And I hope that some of these kinds of ideas can be applied to this whole question of language acquisition, which is still a very open question. Here we go again. Here are two big problems. One is there is no comprehensive theory of signal modulation, and that is, to me, a very important problem, whether we're talking about governments or whether we're talking about ecosystems. And this is a problem that is not going to be solved rapidly. This is going to take extended efforts over a long period of time. And coevolution in networks is another thing. And here we have lots of good theory about networks in certain forms. So we have the small world models, we have scale-free networks, and so on. But notice again, these are snapshots. These are not how these things develop over time. Again, I think this is a very difficult problem. It's going to take quite a bit of time. Finally, this is the final slide. I claim that even if we're going to take a crude look at the whole, it can't be at one level. It has to be layered in some way or other. And that, in order to really get this crude look, we've got to take into account that all of the systems that we know about that are complex adaptive systems have hierarchies. They have urns within urns within urns. And in order to even look at this crudely, we have to take this into account, that we're going to miss something critical otherwise. I'm ready for questions.
Any questions? Please.
Nikolai Berezhnoy from School of Biological Sciences, NTU. In one of your first slides, you mentioned that there is no program for open-ended evolution. And I would like your thoughts on the program of biomorphs from the book of Richard Dawkins, Watch Blind Maker. So is that not a good example?
Your question it raises something that's very important. Yeah, Richard's, what he did with the essentially mutation recall, and the problem there, from what I mean for open-ended evolution, is Richard, although he did a few experiments along these lines on human preference for some of these things, he did not have a fitness function. The result is that I can get unlimited variation by using a random number generator. The question that's critical is, what are the selection criteria, and then how do these things interact as they're selected? And that's where I don't know of a model. I know of some interesting attempts, but they all flatten out way too soon.
Thank you.
Please.
So thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was very interesting how you very elegantly segmented things, and so that was really interesting. So this is a question that doesn't touch upon your main themes. I made the mistake of claiming that biological systems were optimal to an entire panel of biologists. And I wanted to clarify, because I'd be interested in knowing what your opinion on this is. So I come from the perspective of optimal control. So I see everything as being this optimal control problem. And so the claim that I would make is that you, rather than saying that something is not optimal, because you need some sort of element of repeatability, I'd be interested in saying that maybe it's just not the same sense of optimal. So maybe it's not energy conserving, maybe it's not something else, but maybe it's something that it follows some guide, some like objective, and that allows us to do or have some element of repeatability. I don't know if you would agree with that statement, or if that fits within what you had in mind when you were saying that.
It is within, but it's a statement I would take with great caution. I actually work with a group of people at the Chinese Academy of Math and System Sciences, where adaptive control is a major feature of what they're interested in. So adaptive control theory is something that I like, and it's fun to work with. Let me try to give the example this way. Take the Krebs cycle. The Krebs cycle is well defined. It's 8 enzymes. You could look at it, and you could ask what the throughput of the system is, and could I tweak those enzymes a little better to make, in control theory, I'd call that the plant, to make the plant produce more of the critical chemicals. And the answer is you can. But there's more to it than that. As I said, the Krebs cycle is amazing. You find it in carrots as well as elephants. It's everywhere. It's ubiquitous. Now, this is back to this notion of building blocks. The thing that, so to speak, this is my conjecture, caused the system to stop before fine-tuning this any further was that it has attachments that lets it attach to other reactions. And it was better to fix this and the attachments around it so that it could be used as a building block one level higher. It was better to have a standard building block than to keep fine-tuning this and not have a standard building block. So the claim is that that is what happened evolutionarily. Now, if you were careful, I think by putting in the layers, you might come up with a new definition of optimum that would encompass this, but I don't know of one as yet.
I am Martin Reiser from NTU, School of Art, Design and Media. I did not understand your point about mutation not driving evolution. Recombination would account for the variability of different individuals in a gene pool. But for a gene pool to evolve in a new species, as I understand, the theory requires mutation. So why you say mutation is not accounting for evolution?
Okay. Let me first make a couple of points along that line. We now know, although relatively recently we did not, that there's a free exchange of genes between bacteria. Horizontal transfer, it's called. And it's massive. It's massive. And the genes that move around actually give rise to different capacities, different kinds of bacteria. So even if I fix the pool of genes and allow this exchange, I'm going to get new species at the level of bacteria. There's another side point here that's worth noting. We tend, how should I say this, to look down on bacteria. But in fact, 90% by weight of the biocarbon flow in our world is through bacteria. And we know so little about bacteria. We take a cubic meter of soil, and most of the bacteria can't be cultivated by normal circumstances. We know so little about bacteria that, in effect, we're like a CEO in a corporation that's trying to budget things not knowing 90% of the budget. It's just, it's really incredible that we don't pay more attention to that kind of thing. Now, going back to your point, one could ask quite reasonably the question, can I get new species by recombination alone? My claim is yes, indeed. And these variants that we get originally, gradually, if they get isolated, and this is many things, but if I have these barriers, these semi-permeable membranes, then I can get separate kinds of mixing of genes just in different boundaries. So my claim would be that mutation is critical, but only for replacing genes that get lost. If I don't have the gene, I can't recombine it. So I can afford a very low rate of mutation to get these new genes. But most of evolution and most of the fitness changes come from recombination. That's my claim.
Then I have a second question. Can you give some example of the application of this very interesting EARN model, somewhere it was applied to a problem successfully?
It's so new that, at least new to me, that the closest I've come is like the calculation of the coupled EARN versus the pair of uncoupled EARNs. I think that's a fruitful direction to move, and I would try to do some simulations along that line as well with more complicated versions.
Before we form an institute, I have two more questions. John, here I am.
Oh, Peter.
So first, a reaction to this thing about the mutation. You're right about mentioning this jumping genes. They seem to be much more important than we ever thought. In addition to that, there's the epigenetic effect, where we can actually get kind of Lamarckian evolution going on within 1 or 2 generations. So that's really remarkable.
Yeah.
But that was a remark. I have actually a question coming back to this optimization and control, if you like. personally, I don't believe in that, and I want to have your opinion on it because of the following thought. Most biological systems operate completely out of equilibrium, and if they would be in some kind of optimum and some disturbances come along, the whole system would collapse. You get a cascade of errors propagating to the system, and that's what we see in metabolic regulating systems there, where you can actually disturb them and they somehow find another way to operate. And that would be your EARN model could really help us to start reasoning about these things. We have never done that. We have never really thought about, if you have your EARN model as a production chain or whatever you want to call it, and then we add noise to it, how would let's say the signal transmission still survive that noise? Because we know noise is critical. It's not just an annoyance, but it should be there. It might be there to actually drive the operation of the system. So there might be a co-evolution, if you like, of noise and order at the same time. And we never were able to study these things, but maybe this EARN model could give us some way of thinking to deal with that. So what's your opinion on this?
I would hope so, very much. And I think as part of the reason, you could see how you might imitate some of this. I mentioned Morton Christensen's whispering around the circle kind of thing. And I think you could imitate that thing with a bunch of EARNs and selective transmission. One thing that goes along with that is that I find that perhaps part of the reason tags are so prevalent is because they're shorter and therefore more resistant to noise, and also more easy to recover if they get a little bit distorted. So I don't know. That's, again, a conjecture that one might try.
So we tried, maybe this is to get us thinking, we tried a thing where we sent noise into a network, a metabolic network or whatever you have, and then looked how that actually the signal transport can actually be enhanced by the noise through some kind of stochastic resonance that you get. And it seems to be very crucial. So maybe we can take this offline and discuss this. I would love to do that with your EARN model.
Yeah, it sounds like fun. Yeah.
Okay, there are a couple of hands. Can we just start from that gentleman first, on that side?
Yes, hi, Peter Bratton. I was wondering if you can elaborate more on how we can interpret the boundaries and the signals in a social system, and also whether it has to be a physical system or if it could be a non-physical system.
To answer the latter first, certainly not physical. And my being exposed to language, I think about dialects. And in Southeast China, there are 200 so-called dialects, but in Europe, they would be languages. And people that are 50 miles apart on the same river will not understand their dialects. Now, so language in that case is the boundary. And it filters, and that, it's not as simple as that, but that's this us and them kind of thing again. I'm going to trust the people more who speak my dialect than the people that don't. And, there was a time in the United States where we had all these Native American tribes that spoke a great range of dialects. And it's interesting that if you're pushed, then there was an almost universal sign language that Native Americans used to communicate. And this was for certain kinds of trade. But then when it came down to the critical issues as to whether we're going to war on that tribe over there, that was dialectical. So boundaries, they, in effect, they need not be physical. They can affect some things and not others. And all we have to do is look at the Congress of the United States to see how this works.
Okay, please, and then.
Greg Fisher. John, can we go back to the discussion about sort of anticipation? I'm thinking specifically about the problem of reflexivity. Okay, so if we're interacting, I'm anticipating you, and you're anticipating me, and you get infinite regress. Would you say, it's my view that reflexivity, that problem, is a greater or more significant problem in human systems because our imagination allows us to creates this sort of reflexive problem. Would you agree with that reflexivity is a greater problem or a greater issue in human systems than it is in natural systems?
I'd start by trying to be a little more, which we don't really have time for, but defining reflexivity. But let me use another set of terms to try to get at what I think is a very similar issue. If I look at the central nervous system, I have what typically is called feed forward through several synapses from, 3 sets of synapses there, lateral geniculate, and then finally to the optic lobe. But then once I get beyond there, I get reflexivity or recirculation. The spikes come back in circles and so on. And this was still the best book, biased, in psychology that tries to relate macro behavior to the central nervous system. In my opinion, is D.O. Hebb's The Organization of Behavior, written more than a half a century ago, but very, very carefully thought out. Well, all right. Now, if I'm talking about this, one thing that humans are very good at, they're not the only ones, but they're good at this business of being able to run things ahead internally. I use the term autonomy. That means that section of your nervous system is only modulated by the input. It's not determined by it. And so I do these things called look ahead, and it shows up especially if I'm trying to play a game or something, but it's all the time. Well, what we would like to know more, and maybe the EARN models can help even in this, is to know how do these autonomous subsystems arise. And we do know things, which is also part of the reflexivity. While this incoming information is mostly feed forward, there is stuff that comes down that fine-tunes it and says, well, I'm looking for this kind of thing. I think that's an important part of language. And some of these experiments in language are incredible, where you take a sentence, you keep the first letter and the last letter of a word and scramble everything in between. And you'll find that you can almost always read the sentence.
Brian first.
Brian Arthur.
Uh-oh.
John, brilliant as usual.
He says that, and then he hits me.
I'm really taken by this, and I think that I'm trying to push you a little bit. You stopped short of saying that what you're trying to do is put a finger on or talk about a major mechanism in evolution that hasn't been talked about that much, and that's the evolution of biological forms via modules and a hierarchy of modules.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if I can get you to stick your neck out and make that claim. That's an idea that goes way back as well, and even Herb Simon talked about that in the 60s and so on. Other comment is that there is another system that works by the evolution of modules and hierarchies, and that is the evolution of technology itself. For example, the laser printer, invented in 1972-73, was put together by getting a laser to write images on a Xerox drum, and using a computer to direct the laser to do that. So you've got modules getting strung together all the time and getting combined and recombined, making ever new technologies. But would you stick your neck out and claim that you're pushing evolution a little farther, please?
Okay. Yeah, restate the very first part of that, Brian, so I answer it more directly.
A lot of the work on evolution and neo-Darwinism has really been, the gradual accumulation of small changes and then bifurcation into species and so on. But what people haven't talked about anywhere near as much is evolution via modules, building blocks, and hierarchies of modules. But this seems to be what you're doing.
And this is typically called, this broad range of problems is called morphogenesis. How do I start from a single fertilized cell and build a multicellular organism where every cell in that organism has the same chromosome, the same building plan? Okay, and this, interestingly enough, one of the most significant papers that was written in this area was written by Turing, the same man that invented computers, on morphogenesis. And it's a very simple idea. You have two chemicals, one of which presumably yields one color and one of which presumably yields the other. One of the chemicals is autocatalytic in the sense that it speeds up the formation of itself and the other chemical and diffuses rapidly. The other is an inhibitor that stops these reactions and diffuses slowly. You start with a homogeneous system and you run it, and you can actually do, in this case, the differential equations, and you wind up with something with spots. And then if you change the shape, it winds up with stripes instead of spots and so on. It's a nice thing, but nobody really followed up on that paper. I would hope that by putting urns within urns, that you could, in fact, watch the formation of a multicellular, multi-urn thing with hierarchy. But you know, that's conjecture. I mean, the format is there. The question is what would happen, whether it'd be interesting.
John, thank you for formalizing ideas that have been floating around. This is Maarten Borsson from Holland. I would like to take this one little step further, maybe. Assume that the filters allow for errors and let through signals that are almost fit the filter. That if that ability of false signals to get through your boundaries is not too big, it will probably not disturb your system too much, but do you have any idea how far you can take that and at what level the system will break down?
I'm afraid I've got a quick answer. I don't. I think that that's one of those things that I would like to do and would be very productive with an exploratory model, to get some initial idea of what to look for. But I don't have, I think this happens in biological cells often.
Even in technical systems?
Yeah. Yeah. And even in music.
You'll hear tonight, yes.
Mike?
There is a discussion in this context of a complex adaptive system of the question of reductionism or the method of reductionism. And I would very much like your point of view. And if I look at the urn model, it is a reductionist model. Yeah? Small particles I can understand, which in interaction have emergence. But some people say reductionism must be given up in ever to understand a complex adaptive system. Please comment on this question.
This question is tied up with the notion of emergence, and whether emergence is something that's holistic or whether I can show it as something coming from beneath. Now, again, I attribute this to Murray. Murray says that if you go 3 orders of magnitude in any direction, you have a new science. And so quarks to nucleons to atoms, each time you've got about 3 orders of magnitude and you have a new science. Now, the question is then, what's the relation of the new science to the old science? And in my terms, this is very much a matter that the laws at the lowest level constrain what can happen at higher levels. I don't dare violate them. I'll be unhappy, and so will both scientists, if I violate laws at lower level. But I still have room. So if I talk about, say, a water molecule, and then I talk about fluid flow, I use the Navier-Stokes equations for fluid flow. That wouldn't make any sense for individual molecules any more than it makes sense to call an individual water molecule wet. Wetness is an emergent aggregate property. The properties of H2O constrain what can happen in the fluid, but they don't determine it. So my view of reductionism is that you have these layers, you have room for new laws at new levels. And the reductionism in the same sense that I can't violate laws at lower, more fundamental levels, but I can still have Navier-Stokes equations. And I can still have, even with physical things, this notion of emergence, that wetness is an aggregate property. It's not,
it doesn't make any sense to call H2O wet any more than it would be to call it blue. And that's the kind of thing, that's the way I tend to look at that.
Okay, no, please.
Uh-oh.
Oh,
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
John, do you think that
When your friends attack you, you really are in problems.
when you assume that a question will be an attack, you've got problems?
Yeah.
Actually, my question was, what more do you think you would have to add to your EARN models in order to have open-ended evolution?
One thing I would have to, and I didn't talk about it much here, but I've actually looked at some of that, and it's even in the book, is how to have hierarchies of EARNs, EARNs within EARNs within EARNs. I think, in fact...
Can't you get that already?
Yeah. I can. I have to be careful when I do it if I'm still going to use Markov mathematics because EARNs are not balls. So if I put an EARN within the EARN, I've got to figure how to do that. But there is a way to do that, okay? And I would like to keep that possibility for analysis. But I still, my claim would be, Bob, that you really have to get to this question of morphogenesis to get open-ended evolution. You really have to do something about having multi-cells, and that gives you agents made of agents, that kind of notion. Now, this is even true of individual cells. You know, the Margulis theory was that free-living organisms got involved, actually engulfed by early, call them bacteria, they weren't quite. And so the mitochondrion has its own DNA. It has the remnants of what it was as a free-living organism, but it in fact was, you got this extra structure, this extra boundary, by simply taking it in and adapting it to the local.
But can't you get boundaries within boundaries of the system you've already got?
Yeah.
And therefore, my question again is, what what else would you need to get open-ended evolution? You say you need hierarchies, but if you can develop that already, what more do you need?
No, I'm at the stage where I believe I can do it.
Just with this?
Yeah.
Okay.
But that's where the exploratory model comes in. Yeah. But yeah, I'm optimistic. But
great.
You know me well enough to know I'm always optimistic.
thank you.
Okay, Song Ji-young I'm here.
I'm
here,
Good.
from Management University. I'm a political scientist myself, but with a mathematical background, so you can tell me all about the mathematical equation. I can process some of it, I think. Let me give you my example. I'm working on irregular migration, trying to use a complexity theory. And I think your recent book, Signals and Boundary, has become sort of my Bible for applying some of the very fundamental concepts.
Just be sure it's not the devil's dictionary.
So it's also quite similar to some of the previous questions raised about the agent and system and then multi-layer system within. My problem is when the system becomes an agent. For example, the migration, you have a state system, but individuals working on different level. And I can probably use some of the semi-permeable membrane concepts to this human migration political system. There is a regular migration, but irregular migration, such as human trafficking, smuggling, undocumented labor migrants, refugees, and stateless people, they move through this small, tiny bit of semi-permeable membranes. But state system doesn't allow these people's irregular movement. And when the state system becomes an agent, trying to what you call steering or manipulating or Neil Johnson say, tweaking the system to allow to narrow down the semi-membrane so that these irregular migration doesn't happen. And it's also relevant to the previous question about the open-ended system. Some systems are open, but not every systems are as open as the other ones. And there's a political question. When a system becomes agent and is trying to manipulate or tweaking the system, and intervention in this individual agent's movement. And there's a question about the normative justification for this tweaking behavior or the system becoming the agent. That's my first question, whether you have any comment on that. And the second question is this whole idea about complexity system using evolutionary biology, the evolutionary idea, Darwinism, let's say. It only works for the survival for the fittest, but what about the survival for the unfit? Because we are human beings, we are different from molecules movement. We have consciousness and purposes and intention, why we move the way we move. So that's my sort of second sort of more normative question for complexity theory.
Okay. Yeah. Let me talk about the first system where, say, well, quickly I'll tell a joke. That most of you who've been around young kids, they reach a point where they say, what holds the earth up? And many fathers, in order to short circuit, or mothers to short circuit this question, will say, well, it's this giant called Atlas that holds the earth up. And then, of course, the child, not being dumb about such things, yeah, but where does he stand? and let's say the father, since I've done this, says, oh, well, he stands on the back of, the elephant stands on the back of a turtle. And the child, of course, says, yeah, but what holds the turtle up? And the father, if he's smart, says it's turtles all the way down. And so if we try that kind of thing about agents, when a government becomes the agent, the government has certain ideas. We see this, one place where we see this right now is between China and the US. There is what Bob would call tit for tat. Each one makes the visa harder and harder to get, charges bigger fees, and so forth and so on. Okay, so this other things get involved than simply filtering who can come in and out. These are statements of one kind and another, too. I think all these things make this very complex. And we're having this big argument in the United States. We have this semi-permeable boundary with Mexico. The migrant laborers, as they often called, are important to the economy, but there's also this political issue. So I find if we're going to study this kind of thing, we need a fairly rich kind of model, and particularly this means we tend to be awfully cavalier about what we say when we say something is fit. We need a much more multidimensional notion of fitness. If not, we wind up with the kinds of things, eugenics and so on, where you try to get rid of the unfit, whatever that means. So I think we have to be much more astute. And here, perhaps, is where big data can help. If we had much more sampling and data about these things, about what actually happens, who gets through the boundary, what do they do after they get through, what happens to their children, and so on. We're about to see in China the effects of the one-child policy. But we also know enough about that's going to be about a 20-year span, and then this thing is going to level out again, where there won't be too few young people supporting the older people. But it's very hard to take those into account. And without being over praiseworthy of my host, I think Singapore does better about this than most countries in the world.
Hi, John. I used to be a biophysicist, and I happened to study morphogenesis by simulation of coupling Turing's reaction diffusion equation with a lattice-based cellular automata model. So actually, the reaction diffusion describes what the tags would do. And once the tags are picked up by the cellular automata, it means the urns would allow the tag to go in. So actually, it has very interesting dynamics. And also, I have a question. Did you say the generation of new tags will drive the evolution of the network?
Did I say, repeat it again?
The generation of new tags would drive the evolution of the system. I'm just trying to think of examples in developmental biology where actually a lot of developmental signals are conserved. So should I expect a more rapid evolution of the tags? or, through recombination, or actually a lot of conservation there? So I have a question here. Also, by evolution from one urn model to a chain of urn, of course, you increase the efficiency of the system. Also, you get the trade-off of the risk of breaking down of the chain where urns don't talk to each other. Also, you're eliminating the possibility of new reaction, right? Because life was from a soup where randomly, molecules find each other and so on. So that made me think of the evolution of universities.
Do they really
we
evolve?
have more and more departments, and every department is more specialized in one thing. So that's why I think Santa Fe is a great place. So.
Yeah. Let's see. One thing I didn't speak much about, but has to be in the urn model if you're doing it rightly, in my opinion, is urns have to be able to reproduce themselves. That is, I have to be able to go for an urn with a certain set of tags to another replica of that. Now we have a population, and now we get back to this notion, if the urn has to, or a set of them, has to collect the resources necessary to make the definitions of the gates that define the urn, then I have an implicit definition of fitness rather than explicit, which I much prefer. An urn is only going to show up in this system if, in fact, it can make replications by collecting the appropriate resources. Now, the same thing goes for a production line, okay? So, or a cascade, as it would be called. Now, in all of this, one of the things that I look at as a guide is slime mold. Slime mold, through most of its lifetime, it depends what kind of medium it's in, but it's either like an amoeba, a single-celled organism, or else it has flagella if there's a lot of water, and it swims around. But it spends its whole lifetime that way until water gets in short supply. And then it sends out a signal, and a whole bunch of these, literally thousands of them, gather into an aggregate. So it's a kind of very simple multi-celled organism. But that's not the end of it. What's really interesting is once they aggregate, then some of those cells get signals that cause them to specialize, and it sends up a tall stalk. And on the end of the stalk, it puts a bud, and on that bud come spores. The only thing that survives of all those thousands of cells are the spores. And they sit there and for years, in cases, until water comes along again. Now, if you're going to do and look at this kind of thing, you've got to be very careful again about what you define as fitness. What's the fitness of these individual cells? And of course, the same thing goes when we talk about social organisms like ants. Is the fitness all in the queen? Well, that doesn't make any sense. And so my claim is, in order to study these, I've got to, first of all, talk about what does it mean for an urn to reproduce itself, and I just avoided that here because that's a whole topic in itself. And then once you do that, and if you close this so you require resources that are available to do the reproduction, then you get away from this business of explicit fitness and you get this implicit fitness. And this really goes back to this question of government agents, where in the long run, if the government can't keep its population going one way or another, then that government's going to fall. And we've seen this, over and over again. Even a great empire like Rome gets to the point where they can no longer sustain the amount of input that's required. And that's not the only reason, but it was a critical reason.
Please. Yes, hello. I'm Alan Wouters from Whole Systems. I'd like to offer some perspectives that inform maybe the question as to what else is needed to model, but also informs this question about optimality or steering. Which direction does the evolution go? And that's the following. And I'd like to apply it to the Krebs cyclus, but also to organizational development.
Okay.
So my answer would be to what else would be needed. It's a relevant representation of context. We're modeling a system. And what I think is needed is a relevant representation of context. And I say this for the following reason. I think there's in the fitness function that we look at for a system, there's two components. One is related to existence, and that's outward directed. And the other one is related to what I would call performance. And that has to do with use of resources. And the first one is really about connectivity. When a system comes into existence, it will remain there if it can connect sufficiently to other elements in its surroundings. That's why the Krebs cyclus remained as the Krebs cyclus. It could link in particularly to other biochemical processes or chemical processes. For a company, it's the same thing. You know, a company comes into existence, and if it can link to customers and suppliers and whatever, it can actually be a viable system, existent. It is not yet optimal. You know, that's when management comes in and we start cutting costs and, you know, getting the maximum bang for the buck. So my thing is, fitness function has these two components. One is about existence, so connectivity. The other one is about performance, so leverage. That's the notion of leverage. And underlying that for me is a thermodynamic principle, in that both actually increase free Gibbs energy.
Okay.
When a system emerges, a new entity comes into being. When that can connect to its environment, you get increased degrees of freedom, so you're basically increasing entropy. So whereas at one level we think, you know, why would the structure emerge? Why isn't it going to maximum chaos? Why isn't, you know, because that's what we think with entropy, but because you have a new entity coming into existence, you actually increase the degrees of freedom at a higher level. So that's about existence. And the second one is, you know, when you get the energy efficiency, you get the enthalpy, which increases. So both are driven thermodynamically. So I'm just offering this as a perspective as to, you know, what is directional? What gives direction? The existence and the resource use. And there are two criteria that go with that. Existence comes before. Nature says, you know, form follows function. So function is about effectiveness, getting into existence, and form is about efficiency. And effectiveness criteria are prior to efficiency criteria. So just as a way of thinking about it, I find it useful, you know, applying to biological systems, human systems, and so on. So there's no question involved. I'm just offering these perspectives and whether they make sense, maybe, you know.
Well, I'd give a bit of a caution in two directions there. While these are well-established ideas, when we come to open systems and not closed systems, you have to be very careful when you apply them in an open system. Now, I give you an example. You turn over every atom in your body in about 2 years. Every atom in your body turns over in about two. Most turn over in a matter of days, okay? So, what I'm looking at is this system with a continual flow of atoms through it. And you're just a superposed pattern on this flow. And so you have to be very careful in these systems when you try to discuss them. And this is true of organizations, governments. You know, a city is a city, even though after 100 years, the people in there are a very different group of people. Okay. Now, when I look at that kind of thing, I think I have to be careful with these classic concepts. I have to really think pretty carefully under which the laws of thermodynamics were developed and so on. Now, the other thing I'd like to say, and this is another thing where we just, until the last 10 years, took a very crude look at things like disease in humans. There are at least 100 bacterial cells in your body for every body cell that you have. So you are an ecosystem, whether you want to be or not. And how you talk about that system should be in those terms, not in terms of getting rid of this or that particular thing or shotgunning, you know, by radiation or something of that sort. And we've seen a lot of that. Then the final point of caution I would make here is that we have terms like life. Now, up until the time that von Neumann built a self-reproducing machine, self-reproduction was considered to be the critical feature that separated living from non-living. Once we can build a self-reproducing machine, we can't get by with that simple notion. Now, so life is like that. My claim is that complexity is also like that. This is what I call the pile of sand notion of definition. If I have a pile of sand, I can recognize it pretty quickly. If I've got a few grains of sand on the floor, I can recognize it pretty quickly too. But in between that, it's arbitrary. When I pull 1 grain of sand at a time out of the pile to say what's the split point between a pile of sand and a bunch of grains of sand. Many of our definitions, and I would claim complexity is like that. If we spend too much time trying to get a precise division, I think much of it will be wasted.
Okay, let's take just one last quick question before we end this session.
This is Brett Gale from Synthesis. This is kind of an invitation to speculation, playing off the remark about the university and your earlier remark about the university. There's been a lot of talk in this conference, not in your talk, about interdisciplinary work, breaking down the silos. And I started thinking about this in tranquil situations. You said specialization increases. And I wonder if you had any speculative ideas about the future of education, because it seemed like this idea of just breaking down boundaries doesn't really fit very well into the model that you're offering. And I thought maybe you might have just a quick speculative remark or two about that.
Well, the University of Michigan, which I dearly love, having been there since 1952, is for me an example in point and typical of almost all the universities in the United States right now. They're becoming factories for production of students, and they're judged accordingly. And budgets, departments are taxed, on and on. Now, the upper administration does a pretty good job of talking about cross-disciplinary research, but the decisions are typically made at the department level. And department levels are a good deal less happy with this notion of, we're a silo and we're pretty well protected in a lot of ways, space, budget, so on. Okay, now, I must say at the University of Michigan, they've done one thing in an attempt to do something like this, what they call cube hires. And several departments get together and they get additional budget money if they can make a case for hiring somebody who crosses the disciplines of the department. Now, who knows how this is going to come out? But it's in much of the world, as I know it, this business of measuring the efficiency in terms of a near horizon has become pervasive. And it makes it very hard to do this long-range, speculative kind of research. And sad to say, again, you're getting a biased opinion, but this is actually happening at the Santa Fe Institute, which was one of the places that was founded on this view.
Aren't these disciplinary boundaries semi-permeable boundaries which are going to concentrate things and catalyze more of the same?
I think that's right, and that's certainly what happened. Resident faculty at the Santa Fe Institute, it gives you a certain kind of efficiency, but you lose something. Now, you've asked it in a way that I think is very important. Can I set up a set of urns where I have both things going on? That's an exploratory question. Right. And I don't know, I've got some speculations, but that's what I would try. Boundaries in themselves don't make this happen one way or another. It's how the signals pass between the boundaries.
Thank you. Thank you for all the wonderful questions. And we have to end this session, and I hope you have other interactions with John. And thank you, John.
Thank you. Oh, yes.